There was only one person in all the 2,886 characters and personalities in the Bible that carried this nickname, Friend of God. His name was Abraham. He was called that 3 times in the scripture. Let me tell them to you. The first time was 1,000 years after his death. The Hebrew king Jehoshaphat, he was threatened by an invading army, and he prayed to the God, and he said, Lord, would you help me? In his prayer, he said, Lord, I'm Jehoshaphat. Abraham is my friend. You helped him. Could you please help me too? 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7. The second time, a few hundred years later, Israel was in exile under the devastation of that enemy, Babylon. There's a prophet over there with them. His name was Isaiah. And he also prayed to God. And here's what his prayer was. Lord, is Isaiah talking to you? I'm the offspring of Abraham. He was your friend. Isaiah 41, verse 8. Could you rescue me from the enemy like you did him? The third mention occurs in the New Testament letter, the book of James. James is writing, and here's his words. Abraham believed God, and it was attributed to him for righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. James 2, verse 23. If you visited Israel today, you would find that Abraham's hometown had a name change. It's no longer called Hebron. It's got a new name. Jews don't live there, Muslims do. And guess what they called Hebron? In Arabic, it's called Khalil, and it's the word friend. Isn't that cute? 3 groups now. We've got Jews, we got Christians, and we got Muslims, called Abraham the friend of God. 3 times in the scripture, Abraham was called that. Now, into my lesson. Jesus is going to have a conversation with his disciples. And it's the night before the crucifixion, John 15:13. He said, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends, if you do what I command you. No longer would I call you servants, for the servant does not know the master what he's doing. But I've called you friend. For all that I have and I've heard from my Father, I have also made known to you. In that passage, 3 times, Jesus uses the word friend in telling these disciples that he was going to die. Well, I told you about Abraham being God's friend, how significant that word was in that relationship. I want you to take that statement now, and I want you to raise it to a brand new level. Jesus picks up this identity, and it becomes God in the flesh relationship with his followers and their relationship with him. You and I have grown up in a culture where personal relationships are very important. And they develop healthy esteem, self-esteem. And if that happens, you can live a life that's fairly well whole, and it's fairly satisfying. And in that process, you've heard the expression identity crisis. All that means is it's an element of self-understanding, a bit of self-analysis. Who am I? What does it mean to be me? While you're thinking about that one, I want you to now to raise your sights a little bit higher. I want you to become a friend of God. Just those 3 words. I want you to take them seriously, because becoming a friend of God is becoming a pretty serious thing. That Abraham story, it all started off. He showed a lifetime of living faith with his God. And those first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, they're going to lay the groundwork. Better yet, it's going to be a bit of a roadmap in which we live. He lived that way, and so are we. And he's going to show us how we can become a friend of God's. Abraham's story begins in chapter 12 of Genesis, and I'm going to show you, as his life moves along, how he became God's friend. And as you're observing it, I want you to see your own friendship with God developing. As you're doing it, it'll probably help you get a key understanding of what that term means to be me. In other words, would the real me please stand up? I'll set the stage for you. In the country where Abraham grew up, all the other gods were unfriendly. They weren't friends of you. On the side of those gods were priests. You wouldn't want to associate with any of those priests. In the Middle East, at that time, idolatry was a big business. Their gods were very mysterious. They were dark forces. They controlled your every move. Their gods had temper tantrums, unpredictable, big outbursts, anger. Elaborate rituals were performed. Sacrifices were made, including the sacrifices of little children. Remember, that was 4,000 years ago. But you know, we're not much different. Our gods are a little more secularized and maybe sophisticated. Like Abraham, we also face anxiety. We face guilt. We face indifference. We face different Chaldeans with different forces. But we now have protection. 32% of the Americans down there as our country neighbors, 32% of American adults carry guns. Here's our modern world in the West. We're a lot like ancient East in Israel. There's an undercurrent of fear, and a lot of it is manipulated. We as Canadians, we've been threatened recently by a 25% tariff on incoming and outflowing goods. Well, even your religion gets manipulated. And if you don't believe what I'm hearing, you can often find that God can become your enemy. Well, I'm here to tell you that's all wrong. There are a lot of things in this world to be afraid of, many people to be afraid of, and they endanger your security. But God isn't one of them. Abraham faced that, and he rose above it. He knew that God was his friend, but God didn't treat him like a teacher's pet. Abraham was not picked to live a charmed life with a bit of special benevolence. He simply lived as God's friend, and he knew God was on his side, and he lived like that. But to be a friend of God, there's some rules to follow. God's not going to pamper you, and there are things involved in a friendship. In any relationship, you're going to find struggles, you're going to find loss, there's going to be tension, there's even going to be turbulence. My best Proverbs is this one: faithful are the wounds of a friend. Proverbs 27:6. A good friend who tells you the truth will say things to you that you don't want to hear, but he's going to say them anyway. And that person that says them is quite honest. And the things that he's going to say, or she, is going to be very painful. They do that because they like you and they respect you, and your dignity and your honor and your uniqueness is going to show up when they show up, and they put you in your place because they care. God's friendship with Abraham started when he was told to leave the house of his family and his friends and take a long journey west. That secure and prosperous Ur of the Chaldees had to be abandoned. God told him, it's time to go. I want you to leave your things behind, and I want you to get out. It was not going to be an easy life. Well, neither is yours. When you left home, did you find it easy? Neither did I. 12 chapters are going to be given to the story of Abraham. And as you read them and you appreciate his difficulties, along with his wife Sarah, he's going to endure decades of childlessness. They're not going to have any kids. He lived through famine in Canaan. Have you ever gone through a famine? He faced danger in Egypt. He suffered the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael from his household, and he endured the trauma of his son Isaac. when God forced him to sacrifice him, his only son, after all those years of having him. And then his nephew Lot, living in Sodom, he bailed him out just in time before the town was destroyed by fire and brimstone. Well, God's friendship meant leaving home. It meant a long journey, dangerous activities, actions required going into the seat of, often going by the seat of your pants. Obedience was difficult, but Abraham made the best of it and he made it work, just like you make yours work when you don't know what you're doing. Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. In it all, Abraham knew that God was right there beside him and with him. Take a look at this sentence in Genesis 12:6. It explains what Abraham faced when he went on into life. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Abraham had just finished his long, difficult trip, found that the country that he was entering into was already occupied. It wasn't the western prairies, a wasteland full of natives and nations. It already had a bustling village, city-states, thriving places of worship, trade routes, stock markets, healthcare centers, trade agreements with their neighbors. That's what he faced when he went into the land of Canaan. When Abraham arrived, he hadn't been told that by God. That was a complete surprise. They were inhabited. The Canaanites dwelled in the land. Everything that Abraham faced was completely unexplained. Well, that was Yahweh's thinking. God knew history. God knew they were there. Why did he leave Abraham there then? Take a look at you. You left your Ur of the Chaldees. You showed up in your Canaan. You were a stranger. How did you make out? Did you make friends? Was Abraham God's friend still? It doesn't tell us in the Bible that Abraham made any friends among all those Canaanites. Abraham is going to learn the hard way that relationships aren't made through social prestige or economic advantage. They're worked out through hardship and lonely journeys, and often at the water holes where the well is. Canaan also had altars. The ancient world was full of them, made of granite, statues galore. Temple buildings, giant statues to their gods, ziggurats, pyramids dedicated to all their gods. Strangely enough, Abraham, he believed in altars. Wherever he went, the Bible tells us that he built an altar. He would build one, and he did it with his own two hands, and he built it out of the stones that he found there on the earth. I'll explain one with the reading of Genesis 12, verse 2 or 6. Abraham passed through the land of a place called Shechem, and there was an oak tree there in Moreh. And then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your descendants, Abraham, I'm going to give you this land. And so he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared unto him. Isn't that amazing? So simple. I listened to God and God listened to me. Have you ever done that at your oak tree in your life? I'm going to keep going in the story. It doesn't stop there. Thence he removed to the mountain on the east to Bethel, and he pitched his tent there with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar again unto the Lord, and called the name of the Lord. He could have kept going back to Shechem. He didn't have to build another altar there in Bethel. If he wanted to get in touch with God, why didn't he go back instead of going ahead? He built an altar wherever it happened to be. Friendship was renewed every time he built an altar, nurtured at each stage of the journey. When you come to the class and you come and listen to me, maybe God wants you to build an altar. Maybe it's a daily, regular thing. Maybe it's a frequency. Whatever stones that you find there on the ground, maybe that's the place where you can build your altar. Altars are where friendships are born. They call one another on the spur of the moment. Somebody calls you and wants to know how you're doing. They drop in, sometimes unannounced. They visit simply for the pleasure of the other guy's company. You don't have to do anything. All they do is show up. Things don't have to get done to have friendships. When you show up at another person's doorstep unannounced, you couldn't become more authentic than being yourself. Abraham's life was curiously empty of accomplishments. You read his life, he didn't accomplish a lot. He hardly asked God for anything. But he did one time when he interceded for Sodom that God wouldn't destroy it. But that's about it. He kept building his altars, but I don't think he built it as an insurance policy. He wasn't trying to buy God out so that he could get his good inheritance. His altars, it seems to me, were simple acts of friendship, just gratitude and expressions of respect. Abraham, remember, was no saint. All of you listening to me, you are just as good or better than he was. Just because he was God's friend, it didn't make him any better, or it didn't make him any worse. He lived to protect his own skin. Down there in Egypt, before the Pharaoh, he exchanged for a sacrifice of his wife, the reputation of his wife. He laughed at God when God kept his divine promise and said, "You're going to have a son." Me, in my old age, have a son? Come on. He became coward with Abimelech. This friendship story is quite simple. Abraham was in touch with God, who was in touch with him. He accepted God's concerns. In return, he made God the center of his life. And he obeyed, he journeyed, he prayed, he believed, and he even built altars. And if you're the person who can respond and grow and listen and act, that's all God did with Abraham, and that's all he wants to do with you. In return, in that relationship, you're going to find a friend. Abraham in the biblical story is like in a Rembrandt painting. You see the hand or you see the face singled out with a dark background. But you can see that little single shaft of light that comes and it almost says, "I'm a friend of God." Do you want to be a friend of God? It's simple. You can do it where you live. I'm going to close with a story that I think all of you would identify with. You ever heard of the name Louis Braille? He was born January the 4th, 1809. His hometown was in France, Coupvray. His story begins at the age of 3. When Louis's parents, Monique and Simon Braille, they had a business making harnesses and saddles. One day in the workshop, little Louis, he was playing with his daddy's tools. One of the tools that he picked up was an awl. Do you know what an awl is? It's just a long spike item, sharp point, and has a little wooden handle like a golf ball. He was playing with it, and he accidentally poked himself in the eye with it. When he did, shortly after that, the other eye also got infected. Louis Braille lost both eyes at the age of 5. Total blindness. Well, Louis's parents, they wanted him to obtain an education, so they enrolled their son in a village school where he could learn just by listening. It wasn't a blind school, it was just a normal school, but all he could do was just do it by listening. He was determined, that little guy, and at the age of 10, he received a scholarship to attend a blind school for the youth in Paris. And while he was there, the school was visited by a French army officer named Charles Baudrier. What this man did, he told the class by introducing a 12-dot cryptograph system created for his soldiers for nighttime battlefield communication. And it was a system of 12 dots that represented different symbols on a thin piece of paper. Young Louis Braille, he listened to this and he got an idea. Could this be adopted as a form of reading and writing for the blind? Could that be a useful tool that they could use to see and be educated? Well, for the next 3 years, from age 12 to 15, Lewis carefully studied Officer Barbier's system. But instead of 12 raised dots, he used a 6-dot system. He wanted the blind to use just the single finger of his index so that he could go along on 3 dotted lines vertically next to each other with different combinations of dots formed with different letters and different punctuations. And from that moment on, little Lewis spent every working moment outside the class poking holes in the paper with these little dots. Here's the irony of that story. His tool was his father's awl that he had used to poke out his eye, that accidentally blinded him. And then the complete Braille system was born, a tactical reading and writing. In 1824, for the first time, Lewis presented his findings to his peers at his school in the classroom. At age 20, he published the first Braille book, a method of writing words for the blind. And Lewis's Braille led him to become a national hero and international hero. The poor guy died at the age of 43, January 6, 1852, due to tuberculosis. But Lewis celebrated it worldwide as a genius who helped the blind to see. And in his short lifetime, he used his own Braille dot system to become an accomplished musician. He became a writer, a researcher, an inventor, and even a teacher. His little revolutionary invention traveled all over the world. Braille reading has not changed in 200 years. Abraham became God's friend. Louis Braille became the blind man's friend. Isn't it interesting that the both languages aren't very different? You choose someone this week to become your friend. You don't know who that may be. God became a friend to Abraham, and his friendship carried him all the days of his life. That's a great story. Thanks for coming to hear it. See you next time.